Hi, I'm Sherry Young, and I'm here today with Tom Rath, and it's my great pleasure and delight to get a chance to do this interview with you for our oral history project. And it's especially wonderful because we've worked together now for more than 30 years.
Wow.
And so we've been together a long time, but there's still a lot of history that I know pieces of. I don't know all of it. And I'd love to explore a little bit of it today and see if we can capture some of these fun stories for our audience.
Okay.
You served in the Attorney General's office in the 1970s, and you actually served with Warren Rudman and David Souter, and became the AG yourself in 1978. Would you talk a little bit about what it was like? You started, I think, right out of law school.
Well, actually, I clerked a year for federal judge in New Jersey, and then my wife and I wanted to come back to New England, so I wrote a bunch of letters, blind, and I got a call one afternoon. This fellow said, "My name's David Souter, and the legislature has just approved some new positions in the Attorney General's office. We'd like to interview you for one." So I said, "When would you like to do that?" And he said, "Tomorrow." So Chris and I drove up overnight and had a meeting the first thing the next morning with David. And while we were there,
he was
the deputy AG.
Deputy
He was deputy AG. And while we were in the midst of an interview, which anybody who ever interviewed with David knows they're not simple interviews, in blustering came this individual full of energy, and David was dressed, of course, in a three-piece suit. In came this guy in a sport jacket, just fuming at something that happened in the legislature. Opened the door, we were having an interview, and just kind of blew off steam for 30 seconds, then closed it. And I looked at David, he said, "That's the Attorney General." That's how I met Warren Rudman. And then, so I got hired. David called me the next day and said, "I want to offer you a job." I had come back to Trenton where I was clerking, and I said, "Oh, that's great. How long do I have?" He said, "Well, to close the business today would be good." So I called a friend of mine who had been a professor of mine at Dartmouth and knew a lot about New Hampshire history, and I checked out the AG's office and everything, and he was a Democrat, but gave very high marks to what was going on there, what Rudman was trying to do. And so I started there, I think, in the fall of '72, and was there, as you said, 8 years. I tried mostly criminal cases. I did two things. I did homicide cases, and then I did a lot of appeals to the Supreme Court. What was it like? It was obviously a change. The AG's office had been, for many years, a good office, but not a lot of sort of energy to it. And Rudman and Souter were, with new positions, were bringing people in who were more aggressive. Rudman had expanded and gotten a consumer protection division in the office, a broader scope in terms of criminal justice. So a lot of people who were really driving hard to see how government could work and make sure government operated effectively. And I think the whole bar was changing then. It was a much smaller bar, and it was a time of real change in the AG's office with some really talented lawyers that I work with. I don't put myself in their league, but we really had a lot of, as I said, energy and kind of a new perspective on things. And we were empowered by Warren, and then when Warren left, by David, to do those things. And I think where the AG's office has been a force in other states, it was becoming that here. Other states, they always had the political clout of the AG who ran for office. We do not have an elected AG. I think it would be a mistake if we did. But still, Rudman upped the profile of it greatly and got us involved in different things and in different issues. And working with people who were there then and who David subsequently hired really opened my eyes to what the practice of law could be and what the public practice was and how government operated. And I really learned a tremendous amount, and I loved it. It was next to this job, being your partner, it's about as good a job as I've ever had.
The 70s were kind of a tumultuous time, and I think Meldrum Thompson was governor at that time, and he was a bit of a flamboyant character. You had some interesting experiences where you had to communicate pretty closely with Mel Thompson. You want to talk about the Clamshell Alliance?
Well, you're right about Governor Thompson. I have to say, at one level, he was extraordinarily good to me. And whether you liked or disagreed with his politics, if he was a gentleman, he was pleasant to deal with. He was mercurial, but had a very strong sense of who he was. But and the clamshell's a good example. If you convinced him that there was a way we ought to try something, and he got on board, he stuck with it. And as I say, I owe him a great deal. We had
he appointed you.
He appointed me. He made me first deputy when David succeeded Warren, and then when David left to go to the Superior Court, I became AG. The Clamshell Alliance was the lead protest against the construction of the Seabrook nuclear power plant. And it's hard today to remember that that was such a divisive and significant issue. Public service, which had been a very successful, small, well-run utility, basically in New Hampshire and not much beyond, took on itself to construct what would have been, if both units had been constructed, not just a nuclear power plant, but the largest nuclear power plant in the world, which was the size the nuclear industry was going to. As you know, Unit 1 opened, Unit 2 never opened, but there was a lot of protest and dissent about nuclear power. And it went on through infinite numbers of court tests and administrative challenges, but it also spilled over into the streets. The Clamshell became kind of a umbrella organization for those who opposed nuclear power for any one of a number of reasons. When David was still AG, we had a demonstration there, on a weekend demonstration. And when it was over, we arrested 2,500 people. And because they refused to leave the premises, so we arrested them on the grounds of criminal trespass. And they were carted off, and we didn't have any place to put them. And they took a position called bail solidarity, which means if you don't give him bail, I'm not going to give you bail. I'm not going to take bail. And they were going to break the system, choke the system. And they didn't give accurate names. I mean, it was an extension of their I will say, sort of
civil disobedience.
Civil disobedience, and it certainly was. I respect that. But still, we had a system we had to operate. So we tried to figure out where to put them. And we ended up saying the only place we can put people are the armories. So we had, I think, 4 large armories in the southern part of the state. We put cots and emergency, and we put them in the armories. And as soon as we did that, there was a lawsuit, a cruel and unusual punishment, and we had a suit to enjoin it in front of Judge Bounds, who was then presiding as only he could preside over the federal district court. And we had 2 or 3 days of testimony. I remember one of the complaints of the group was that the food was not organic and it was not safe. And the head of the National Guard, who was in charge, was John Blatzos, was a great guy and was had run a restaurant in Manchester. He was offended by this, and he said, so Judge Brown said, well, what do you serve them? He said, we give them Egg McMuffins for breakfast. And it was, nobody had planned for this, so we didn't have a lot of stock there. And that was a big ejection. And it just kind of was, it got that kind of thing. There were no freshly cut flowers to break up the oppressive nature of the armies. So anyways, we got through that. We sustained them, and we basically said, after they had been there 3 years, 3 days, we said, we're going to dismiss the cases and take it for time served. So we made our point, they made their point. So then when I became AG, there was going to be another big demonstration, bigger than the last one. And I sat with public service, and their interest was in building the building. And the Clamshells was making a point. And I sat with a group of them, and I said, look, I have very minimal interest in this. I have a little law, criminal trespass. And if you break that law, I don't have any choice but to prosecute you. Don't put my law in the way of your statement about nuclear power. Whether you agree or disagree with nuclear power, just leave me out of it. They went back and forth, and I said, well, suppose I let you come on for 3 days. You can demonstrate, you can make speeches, whatever you want. If I get the company to waive its rights to oust you, will you leave of your own accord on Monday morning? And they basically said they would. So I said to my assistant, who owns that property? Because it turned out it was owned by a family that you will remember called the Tamposi family.
Okay, yeah.
And I knew Sam, and I called him up and I said, will you waive your right for 3 days? So he did. So the union leader went after us, and me particularly. I was younger then, much younger then, and they made a point of that. And they went after Mel Thompson really hard for allowing us to go forward with that kind of a deal. And to his credit, Mel Thompson stuck with me. William Loeb himself was coming out after us on the paper, and he was kind of Mel's political patron saint. And they came in on Friday, and we had 3,000 plus on the site. And Monday morning, they all left, just like they said they would. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we ever again had another demonstration because we indicated that you don't have to have violent or confrontational demonstrations. And I had said to them, you know, as I look at the project down the road, what's going to really test this project is not you in the streets, but its financial viability. And can they get it licensed in time? And of course, that went on for years before it opened. But that was my first instance, and that was a kind of thing that that the AG maybe prior to the Rudman years would not have gotten involved and just let happen. But it was you could see the emergence of the office as a force. And once we did that, I mean, I think we became front and center, not necessarily in that debate, but as a kind of a clearinghouse where different sides could get a fair hearing. And it only works if you had good lawyers, and we had very, very good lawyers.
Now, when you went through the years in the AG's office, it seemed anyway that there was a progression from deputy to AG. So Warren was the AG, David was his deputy, became the AG, you were David's deputy, became the AG. I think Greg Smith was your deputy, and he became AG. But in more modern times, that kind of progression is not followed. Can you speak to
Well, yeah, I think
differences?
I can. First of all, I was told by David when I became AG that my primary job was to pick my successor. So, and Greg and I had worked together for a long time. I think it's harder. We're almost a victim of its own success. As the AG's office became more prominent and more central to the political debate in the state, and some of our alumni went on to seek and win political office, it became harder to make it a sort of career move. Mm-hmm. And I look back and I think, well, of course, everything was better when I was there, but I really think maybe in some ways it's appropriate because you can get to internal. I think bringing in different people maybe freshens it up and gives them a new approach. And that certainly changed back when governors began appointing their legal counsel. Governor Sununu appointed Steve Merrill, who was his legal counsel, mm-hmm. and Kelly Ayotte was Governor Benson's legal counsel. I mean, mm-hmm. we've seen that progression mm-hmm. over the years, and Governor Delaney, I mean, Attorney General Delaney was Governor Lynch's legal counsel. I think that's not a bad thing. And don't forget, Warren Rudman was Walter Peterson's legal counsel. Right. So it's not uncommon. And I think by and large, it's very well served. Now, the office is significantly larger now, but its workload is much heavier than it was when I was there. I think we maybe at our height had maybe 20, 22 lawyers and significantly bigger than that now. But I think it reflects the breadth of the thing. And I've always thought, I was always incredibly grateful for the time I was there, opportunity at a very young point in my career. But the lessons that you learned, and I think it was important for me to, having done it, not to stay there, to get out and use it and let other people come through. You don't want to breed into that office a rationale that says, well, this is the way we've always done things. Mm-hmm. I think you want people who've got energy and fresh perspectives to challenge the givens, and I think the office has turned into that.
Great. You referenced that some folks went on to political office, and I'm going to ask you about Warren in a minute. But before we get there, before Warren became senator, there was a race that between Wyman and Durkin that had an interesting storyline to it. I wondered if you could share that with us a little bit.
Well, I never forget, it was the night of the election in '74, and I got a call about 10 o'clock at night, as I was then head of the criminal division. The criminal division was really the lead trial lawyers for the state. So when anything, the evidence or collecting it or trying to focus it on something that might go to court, we naturally get a call. Warren called me and said, this race is very, very close. And he said, we're probably headed to a recount. And he said, I need you to get familiar with election law, and I need you to take over what we're going to do. Now, we had never had a recount of this magnitude. And one of the first things we did is I talked to the Secretary of State was a fellow named Bob Stark from Goffstown. And his deputy was Ed Kelly, and we talked to them, and I said, what do we do with these ballots? Well, do they stay there? I said, no, we're going to bring them all to Concord. And we sent the state police out and brought all the ballots to Concord. They would sit where they normally were until you ever had a recount. So we actually brought all the ballots physically to Concord. That's now practice. They do it automatically, and they bring them in, so they have control of the evidence. We have now something called the Ballot Law Commission. In those days, the Attorney General was a member of it, the Secretary of State was a member of it, and the third party was a member of it, usually a lawyer who's appointed by the governor. That's changed now. But basically, the Ballot Law Commission was designed to resolve election questions and not go to the Supreme Court, try to get it done right there. So it was before this, it was obviously a very close election. I think the initial night showed Wyman winning by like 72 votes or something like that, clearly within the margin. So we brought them all into Concord. I'll never forget this. And that vote, that Senate seat, was the difference between a veto-proof Senate and a Senate that could filibuster around the president.
The Democrats were
right, yeah.
in the majority.
Right, and so they were in the majority. And the theory was when you finally got it to Washington, which it eventually would, the Democrats would seat the Democrat. I mean, the law of that is that the body, the Senate, is the final judge of the elections and qualifications of its members. So at the end of the day, they were going to make the decision. And the harder thing to do would be to make that decision if the Republican was holding a certificate of office, certification of office from the state.
From the state, okay.
So that's what happened. That was the framework of it. We had no idea how close this was going to get. And we brought all the ballots in. And I forget because the second day of the recount, my father passed away, and I had to drive to New Jersey. And that Saturday morning funeral, I walked out with the family, and there was Warren. Warren had flown down just to see me, and then he looked at me, and I think he knew. He said, "I want you back at work on Monday. We got to do this recount." And it was one of the hardest times of my life, but it was also one of the best because I had something that I was
had to do.
It consumed me 24 hours a day for weeks. And we went around the state. We only had a few voting machines, and they looked like telephone booths. So we had to crawl down to the basement of the Exeter Town Hall and open these things up and all. And it was an incredible process. At one point, the Democrats brought an action before Judge Bounds to stop the recount, and said, "Look, you're all going to fuss and fume about it. In the end, it's up to the Senate to decide, and this is all, kind of puffery." And so Joe Millimet, one of the great giants of the bar, represented the Democratic Party, and Stanley Brown, an equal giant, very different in stature, or demeanor, but they were both highly, highly powerful lawyers at the time, represented the Republicans and Wyman. So one represented Wyman, and I represented the state. And they got up in front of Bounds and they argued, Wyman says this and it's his seat because he won it. And Durkin said, no, this is my seat and I won it. And I got up in front of Bounds and I said, Your Honor, with all due respect, neither one of them owns that seat. I represent the people who own the seat, and we have a right to get it resolved the way our law says we get it resolved. And in the end, that Judge Bounds found merit in that argument, and we won the case, and we went through to the end of the Ballot Law Commission, and we declared Wyman the winner by 2 votes.
Wow. And
it went down to the Senate in Washington to a special committee designed to do it. And it was clear they weren't going to get a result. We did it back and forth, and there were powerful forces on both sides. And I remember talking to Governor Thompson about it, and I was not AG at the time, I was assistant, and I said, they're not going to give you we need to have a special election. They're never going to accept
They're not going to seat.
They're never seated. But we have no provision for it. So we came up with an idea that if they declared the vacancy, that they could not seat somebody, in that circumstance, we would have a special election. And we passed a bill to that effect. And I took it down to the Senate. and the Senate did declare a special election, sent it back. John Durkin won by a lot, but one of the most interesting, and in fact, Don Tibbets wrote a book about it, closest U.S. Senate race in history, and it was a fabulous case for a lawyer, and it was really interesting. And I, as you probably can guess, had a little bit of politics running through me, anyways.
Yeah.
And so it really impacted me. But then it was a major case, and it was a major part of certainly of the cases that I've tried. It really set, in a funny way, the politics of the state in a very different direction.
Well, on that theme, I know that you worked with Warren when he ran for Senate, and he won in 1980, and that was an interesting election. As I recall, there were a lot of candidates in that race.
We had, I think there were 8 candidates in the senatorial primary, and there were 11 in the House primary. In fact, our colleague, Annie Custer's mother, Susan
Right,
McLean,
that's right.
ran for that seat and lost to Judd Gregg in that primary for the Republican nomination CD. Warren ran against a whole passel of candidates, including John Sununu, Wesley Powell.
But that was the first time that John Sununu had emerged, wasn't it?
He had run, John had served in the House of Representatives from Salem.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Then
Okay.
he tried to run, he wanted to run for executive council, but he had not lived here 7 years. So he couldn't run. He then came back and ran for the Senate, where there was several years, and was a very, very good candidate. And the irony was that he and Warren became very good friends during that campaign. But we had George Roberts, who was then the Speaker of the House in the race, Senator Dave Bradley from Hanover, very prominent sort of centrist, and it was quite a battle. And we hired Dick Morris, who would later reach great fame as a pollster and all, to be our advisor. And it was a real eye-opener for me in terms of how things worked. A fascinating campaign. I had left the AG's office because I wanted to work in the campaign. Got into private practice at Orrin Reno Sand. This could be a large part of what I do. And he won, and then Durkin was up for re-election. The irony was this was Durkin's re-election, and Durkin, when he was in the Senate, had blocked Warren from becoming chairman of the ICC. Gerald Ford appointed to be chairman of the ICC.
Oh.
And had Warren become chairman of the ICC, I'm convinced he never would have come back.
Probably would not have
never
run
come
for
back to New
Senate.
Hampshire. So there was certain irony that he ran against Durkin, and he won handily, and that was the year Reagan got elected president, and the Republicans took the Senate. So that's the wave that Warren on. But that was my first one of that size in the state, and it was a great election. And I think we ran the whole race for around $200,000. Well, today
Wow.
a Senate race is probably $6 or $7 million. So it really has changed a lot.
Significantly.
Yeah, I'm not sure for the better, but
Yeah. Why don't you talk? Warren just passed away last November, and there were several, at least 2 ceremonies, one very moving down in Washington and another beautiful ceremony here at the Federal District Courthouse. Can you talk a little bit about Warren's legacy? Why he had such an impact on the New Hampshire screen?
I've thought a lot about that since he passed, and it's one of those individuals in your life that you still think is there. Things will happen. I'll think I need to tell that story to Warren,
Yeah.
and he's not there, and it's difficult. His energy, his zest, his supreme self-confidence that he showed the rest of the world masked a really very, very sensitive and as insecure as any of the rest of us individual. And I think the way he treated those who worked for him, with him, the confidence he gave them, the trust he showed in them, the willingness to share credit, I think those are things that, as I've had the chance to work with people and run operations, I've tried to treat people that way. It took a toll on him, and I think that's one of the reasons that I was always reluctant to get into myself, is that I saw the price that he paid with his family, and that he couldn't always be there when he wanted to be, and it was a real balance, and I saw that, and that's a cost way beyond missed income or opportunity. You don't get that back, and I know there are parts of him that regretted that aspect of it, but he was tenacious, and he had this sort of bulldog quality that everybody talked about. But if you talked to the people in the Senate, and I was very fortunate to become friendly with people like Howard Baker and Bob Dole and on the Democratic side, Vice President Biden. Talk to the people who worked with them, Teddy Kennedy, who worked with Warren, and they'd say, you know, for all that outside, there's a group of about 15 or 20 people in the United States Senate that shut the door and can make things happen. And Warren Rudman was right in the middle of that group. His intellect was superb. His instincts were so strong. There was not a base thought in his head. I mean, he might disagree with you on policy, but not on trying to do things that helped people. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that seat was held for 12 years by Warren and then 18 years by Judd Gregg. And we had 30 years of quintessential Senate insiders who had a high degree of respect by their colleagues. And beyond any legislative bill that might bear their name, that degree of respect and ability to make things happen served this state very, very well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Tell me a little bit about the time that you worked with David Souter when he had been selected as the candidate to go on the Supreme Court.
Well, it's funny. David had first he went on the Superior Court,
right?
And that was he didn't want to go on the Superior Court, and I was going to go on the Superior Court. And we had a long meeting with Governor Thompson. David really wanted to be, as he was AG, he wanted to stay in the AG and then go to the Supreme Court. And life was such.
Oh, so he wanted to be a judge.
He wanted to be a judge. Didn't want to be a
Superior
Court. He wanted to be a appellate judge. And the way things were then, we had a meeting late one afternoon in the Bridges house with Governor Thompson. And he had a high degree of respect for David and wanted to appoint him. And the phone rang. And he went out, came back in. He said, "That was Bill Loeb. I can't do it. Can't make it." So, "Tom, you would always want to be on the Superior Court." I had been cleared to be a Superior Court judge. So, "You want to be a Superior Court judge? I'm going to appoint you in the morning. David, you stay as AG. I'm going to get reelected, and then I'll appoint you to the Supreme Court." And that's the way we left. And I went home, and I didn't sleep at all. And Chris said, "I thought you always wanted to be a judge." And I was 32 years old. And I said, "Who am I going to go to lunch with? What do I talk about?" And the next morning, David came in, and he said he had been up all night. And he said, "Do you think what the governor was saying was, if I go on the Superior Court, he's back in, he'll appoint me to the Supreme Court?" I said, "That's exactly what he was saying." He said, "Well, do you want to be a judge?" "Yeah, I do. So we walked over to Thompson, and that's how that appointment. So he served about 8 years on the Superior Court, much longer than anybody thought, because it actually happened. Thompson lost to Gallon.
Right.
He was a better appellate judge because he had those years on the trial court. And so he's gone to the Supreme Court and had served there for quite a while and done very well. And we knew that there was a shuffle coming at the
U.S. Supreme Court.
At the Circuit Court.
Oh, Circuit
Court.
That's right.
And we had talked a lot to Judge Bounds about how he thought things should happen, and I was the go-between between Bounds and Rudman and could talk openly. And Bounds said to me, "I'm thinking of going. I assume I know who Rudman's going to designate." I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, let's see if we can't make that happen." So he stepped down. Warren was able to get David appointed. And David went up, he got appointed in, I want to say, April or May.
He wasn't there long.
No, and I'll never forget, I was coming back from Amherst, Mass., where I picked up my daughter at a softball camp. We're driving back, and on the radio, it said Justice Brennan had retired. And I just said to myself, that's interesting. No sooner did I get back to living in Newfound Lake that summer, the phone rang, and it was Warren, and he said, "I've talked to Dick Thornburg, who was the Attorney General, and George H.W. Bush was the president, and he said, I think we're going to get David on the list." So David called me, and we talked about it, and I said, "David, you got to at least go down for the interview. You get a free trip to Washington. And nothing's going to come of it." But we talked about it. And Warren has all great stories about David and how it all worked out. And anyways, he was there 2 days. And on that Monday, it was pouring rain. And we were up at Newfound Lake, and the phone rang. And David said, "I'm in the ante room outside the Oval Office." And he said, "The president's just offered me the court." And I stopped him and I said, David, what did you say? He said, I said, yes. And he wanted me to call his mother and let her know he was okay because he hadn't talked to her. So when he did that, we then put together a team out of the White House, so-called, the preparation in those days was called the murder boards, where you went through a very, very grueling sort of mock-up of what you'd see in the Senate confirmation. And we had just come from the Bork hearings, and we studied those, and the Anthony Kennedy ones, which were where we thought he was going to be. And we had a guy named Fred McClure, who was a lobbyist and worked on the White House staff. Boyden Gray was the counsel to
he was legal counsel.
Legal counsel to the president. Yeah. A young guy named I'm drawing a blank on his name, who later Mike, I'll think of it, who was a senior assistant attorney general, and then we had Rob Portman, who was then on the staff, who was a young
he was a
staffer for Boyden Gray. We had Ken Duberstein, who was chief of staff to the president and going to sort of shepherd the thing through. We had a couple of noted Democrats who have never used their names to protect them, and we spent and Bill Kristol was the group who was counsel to Vice President Quayle at the time. And we went through all the preparation, and we it was a little bit like football coaches. We got all the tapes. I remember sitting on the floor in our place at Newfound Lake, breaking down the thing. You know, those days you didn't have the remote controls. You had to stop the video VCR and start it again. We went all through it, and we
to prep him
to
for
prep
the
him.
questions.
And the one thing we did that I always thought changed. Nobody knew who David Souter was. In fact, there was this huge kind of People magazine, people looking in the windows of his house, and he was odd, he was weird, and all the rest. And I remember sitting there with him one night. He had an office, the old executive office building in Washington. It was late in the day, and Warren, just three of us were there. And I said, David, you know, the nominee usually never makes a statement. Go right to hearing. I said, I think we ought to make a statement. Nobody knows you. You haven't given any interviews. Why don't you make a statement? Who you are, your life. Not long, 5 or 6 minutes. Okay. He agreed to do that. And that afternoon, right before the hearing started, he said to Warren, I want to read you what I think I'm going to say. And I read, because in the gathering dusk, and he went through the statement that he gave, which was incredible, and that neither one of us could speak when he finished. And I finally looked at him and said, I think that's fine. And I think when he gave that statement, changed everything about
changed the tone.
Changed everything about them. And there was a little back and forth, but it was, and people, particularly the national press, who were very skeptical of him, became incredibly infatuated by him and his integrity and his character. And, he was a very important member of that court, in my judgment, for almost 20 years. And, I saw the president, 41, several times. And he took a lot of grief for that appointment.
Yes, he did.
Two things about it. One is that Barbara Bush stopped me one day. We were doing something, and she said, I'm really mad at you. I said, what did I do, Mrs. Bush? She said, you were supposed to get him married. And she said, I brought all kinds of people in. They had them over to the house.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
And it didn't happen.
It didn't happen.
I was with the president when he was up here for something else, and it was just the two of us for about half an hour. He's a wonderful, wonderful person. And I said to him, Mr. President, I said, he took a lot of grief about David. And he turned to me and he said, I may have disagreed with some of the decisions he made, but he said, I never disagreed with the man. He said, he's a wonderful man, and I'm really proud of that appointment.
Good.
And I thought, sometimes even at that level, you cut through it.
Yes.
And I think, and that really says as much about George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, as it does about David.
That's great. Well, you've had quite an interesting career as a political advisor, also as a political commentator. You've worked on many presidential campaigns. Tell us some of your more memorable moments How did you get started working on presidential
Well, I mean,
campaigns?
the
Which
first
was
campaign
first?
literally I worked on was in 1964 when I was a freshman at Dartmouth. And Rockefeller was a graduate of Dartmouth and turned Grafton County over to the Dartmouth YRs. And so we went all over the Grafton County, which in those days was harder to get around than it is today with the roads and stuff. And I got to know Rockefeller and David Hess, who's from representative in the state house from Hooksett, and a lawyer for a long time. He was my boss at that campaign. He's much older than me. He was a senior. I was a freshman. And we went all over the place with him. And at the end of each day, and I can never forget it, so we were up in Littleton at the old Thayer Hotel, and we had done all the advanced work stuff. And at the end of the day, we're all meeting together to get a ride back to Hanover. And Rockefeller did this every time we were out there. He would always come over. It was a simpler time. When it was money, Secret Service. Rockefeller would come over and chat with us for a minute, and then he'd always hand it. He says, "Here, it's $25. You guys are gonna get thirsty on the way home." He was pilloried by the union leader, particularly. He was a really interesting and great guy. So I sort of had the bug at that point, and when the Rudman thing made it even more so, and Warren became a very close friend of Howard Baker, and I got to know Howard pretty well from the campaign. And so it wasn't long after Warren got in that I got a call to come to Washington. I was at Warren Reno then, and I got a call to come down and meet with Howard Baker. And he said, I'm probably going to, there was a real question whether Reagan would run for second term because of his age. And he said, he was a majority leader than Howard was thinking about running. And he said, I put together a PAC, and I'd like you to do for me in New Hampshire and other places what you did for Warren. And I had a very, very dear friend who since passed away named Jim Cannon, who was there. And I went to work with Baker in 82 or 83. And I've had every campaign since then. So that's how I got started. And I loved it. I mean, I've been incredibly happy. Some of the great friends in my life are people in that business, including the press. I've done a lot of stuff with the press, and it's different now and Twitter and all the rest, but the great journalism.
I understand you tweet, by the way.
I do tweet. I tweet
you have
very
more than one
infrequently,
follower.
and I have 300 and some odd followers. I don't know where I'm leading them, but yes, I do. I don't know that anybody remembers them. But people like Mary McGrory and David Broder and George Will and my dear friend Dan Balls and all the people, Mark Shields, go way, way back with. And they have been my friends, Al Hunt, in and out of politics. And I've been it's been a great part of my life. It's not one I would have ever seen coming. And I met some wonderful people, and good, on both sides. And I never wanted to do it full time. It's a very, very tough business, but it has, it's allowed me to build some of that into what I do, which is really, kind of advising people. I say to them, well, you're sort of here and you want to get there. And it's my job to figure out the route and who we have to talk to and how it works. And it's been enormously interesting, challenging for me. And I've enjoyed it. And the relationships come out of there. The ability to pick up the phone and talk to somebody and cut through the nonsense and say, can this happen? Can't this happen? Where are we going to go? I mean, you've worked with me long enough to know some of the hardest things you have to say to people, but the best thing you say, it's not going to work.
Right.
And you've got to know how to do that. And I think, and I've been in a lot of rooms on election night, and nobody else wants to say it. And I've had to look the person in the eye and say, this is not going to happen. Most recently, in Boston, with Mitt in 12, and being there I knew at 4:30, and it's hard to do that. It's really hard to do that, but you have to if you're doing your job right.
When you left the AG's office in 1980, you went into private practice with Warren Reno, and you had certain goals that you wanted to achieve in the way that you wanted to practice law. Can you talk a little bit about what your idealism was about how you wanted to practice?
First of all, I was petrified because I had never been in a private setting, and I didn't understand the
right.
economics of practice. I didn't know where the money fell out. I had been doing a lot of litigation, but it was all criminal litigation, and I didn't know who was going to talk to me and anything. And I had a couple of offers from private firms, and Governor Gallon wanted me to do another term as AG, and Hugh Gallon was one of the great people I've known, and the people around him, Dayton Duncan, Peter Coles, they were wonderful friends. And I really wanted to stay. But I kept looking at my little guys, and they were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I knew that at some point in time we had to make some choices. So Orr & Reno was a place that Ron Snow, who was then the head of the litigation section there, he had been on the Ballot Law Commission, so we'd gone through the whole Wyman-Durkin thing together.
Oh, he was involved in
and
that.
Ron and
Okay.
I were friendly, and he said, before you do anything, talk to us. So I did, and they offered me a spot in litigation working with Ron. And I went there, and they were extraordinarily good group of people, and they hired you.
Yes,
and,
they did.
It was a really interesting place to be. Good lawyers. It was very traditional, and as I was there, my practice began to shift from straight litigation more and more to kind of interesting administrative government relations problems. And Orr & Reno did no lobbying at the time, and I didn't want to lobby. I did not. Even though I have an orange badge, in the 30 years I've had it, I rarely go over there and lobby. But I was really interested about how you balance representation and relationships, and there were things. They had a very active insurance practice. And a lot of it went through the department, and I started doing more and more with the department, with the commissioner, who was a former state senator. We had a couple of cases we worked on together where we were converting insurance companies from the mutual form to a stock form,
right.
and how that worked. And one of those things led to another, and then while the firm welcomed that work, it wasn't what they wanted to do, and it was never difficult.
They were uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, they were. They couldn't quite see where it was going to go, and then there was this whole new area that opened up on environmental work. And again,
that's when you and I started.
That's when you and I started.
Together.
You had to carry me for 3-4 years, and we found a couple of cases where, knowing no more than anybody else in the room, we walked into a room, forgetting the Andover Mass one day, and there was 150 people in there. And we ended up as counsel to the whole problem.
Right.
And we began to see, there is a future in this if we want to do it. And I got more and more intrigued with it, and we kind of thought through how it might work. And it was a different, nobody was going to change the way Orr & Reno did. They shouldn't. They're incredibly successful, good group of people. And we had this sort of other idea, and we met with Ron finally, and we said, we're going to go our own way. I never forget, you and I walked over to see
Cal Whitten?
It was to see Bruce Clow at the bank.
Yeah.
And we had written out what we thought was a business plan in the back of the envelope and said, this is what we need to do to start this firm. And he said, I didn't want to see it. He said, you got the note. And he said, you got the loan. And today we sit in those very offices.
Right.
So we started in 1987, and I can remember to this day moving the books across.
Yeah.
And we really wanted to build a firm that was, I guess in a funny way, kind of a mini Washington firm that really lived in what I call the intersection between the private and public sectors, that understood regulation, that understood legislative remedies to things and legislative impacts on things, that could put together a coherent strategy as to how to treat with the fact that even though we had a series of governors that believes that government functions best when it governs least, the interaction was increasing. It was getting larger and larger.
Yep.
And almost every aspect
The
of what people,
regulatory
the regulatory impact.
structures.
And
Yep.
we really built, as you know, we really built around that.
Kind of
And-
grew with the regulatory framework.
and that really appealed to me because what I kind of morphed into, I'm not sure consciously, was more or less more of a strategist and a problem solver than necessarily, it's hard to type me as a lawyer anymore. I mean, I
you know
am
what these are, Tom?
I see these law books, I want to notify the carrier. But I think having the background of a lawyer, and I think I was a decent lawyer.
You're a very good lawyer.
Allowed me to give advice differently. And the same thing, not being a lawyer, having a good sense of how the system worked, allowed me to translate what's in these books into reality. And I think we built a large part of our firm, whether it was the environmental stuff, the tax stuff, the energy things, insurance and
Government
regulation,
relations
healthcare,
practice.
all around that problem solving. And I think as we've seen the law practice evolve, I mean, more and more firms are doing
Are
what
following
we've-
that model.
Really following
Yeah.
that. They've started, we have a group inside ours called the Rath Group, which really does not provide legal services, but provides strategic consulting.
Right.
And all the larger firms have done very similar things. We have a very active group that works in the legislature and around the legislature. And and of course, we were all blessed. Why this happened, I don't know. We had on the ballot almost every general election the consideration of changing the Constitution to go from biennial sessions to annual
Annual
sessions.
session.
And it always failed.
Right, for years.
And then all of a sudden it passed.
Yeah.
And then there was no big gap. If you were a lobbyist, you went from January to June, and then they went away for a year and a half.
yeah.
Now suddenly it was, boy, they're back in session. And
For
the
good or
practice,
ill.
that's right. The practice has really grown in New Hampshire since then, and also the creativity of going to the legislature for remedy. One of our most, probably in some ways our most significant cases occurred, as you know, right after we opened. It's right after the Dole campaign went in the tank, and I got a phone call from 2 lawyers from Connecticut that wanted to come to see me because the PSNH had become the first publicly owned utility to go into bankruptcy.
Right.
And we were, a young firm and didn't like turning down work, but we had had a number of opportunities to represent creditors, and an $8,000 or $10,000
In the
fee
bankruptcy.
in bankruptcy,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that looked really good to us. However,
You kept saying, no,
there's something
no.
else out there. Something else out
There's
there.
something big out there. Remember
So
that.
these 2 fellows came to see me.
To our frustration.
Yeah, I know. And they came in and they said, we represent somebody called Northeast Utilities, and we want to buy public service. And I said, well, I don't have a conflict. They said, we know you don't. You're about the only one that doesn't. And so we took that case on, and obviously it was an extraordinary client and great result. But central to that was crafting a piece of legislation
Right.
that would create a rate track, 7 years of 5.5 rate increases and 3 years of holding it flat, and getting that passed in the legislature. And what we ended up doing was a 1-day session a week before Christmas. It was never going to happen, and we did. We got it through. And then with that piece of legislation, PUC went ahead and adopted the rate track. The business went through, and it's been a stable utility
Ever since.
And but key to it was understanding the legislative process and what you could put in a bill and what you couldn't, how it would work. And remember, the guys at Northeast Utility said to me, "No way this will ever last. The state will never keep this bargain," and they did. They were wrong.
They honored it.
They honored it.
They did honor it. So in looking back, 30 years later, are you proud of what we've built together in terms of the firm and the talent and some of our alum?
Yeah, I am. I mean, obviously, I'm enormously proud of you and what you've done, and an example of, especially a time when women were coming into prominence, and your talent, your intellect, and your personal qualities. But I'm also very proud of what we've done collectively, and I think we've been a place that's given back. That was always important to you and I when we were thinking about
Yes.
starting, was a place that was going to be involved in the community, gave back to the community. I think we're good citizens in that regard. And sure, I mean, we put people on the federal bench and the state bench, in Congress. I mean, they all go on to do great things, and I just keep showing up each day. But yeah, I mean, look, this has been, I don't think either one of us would have ever said 30 years ago, this is what's going to happen. And I'm very proud of it. I mean, I really am, and I've had a great time. I mean, when this is done, I'm not getting a refund. I mean, and I have been proud to be a lawyer, and it's a little different way for what we do, and I think others like us make people look at lawyers differently and make a difference. And I think we have contributed in a material way to the quality of life here. And Yeah, I'm very happy with it. It's going to be, as I look back on it now, it's hard to believe that the time has gone by, because parts of me still feel like it was 30 years ago. Now, when I try to climb the stairs, I realize it's not. But it's the challenge, and beyond anything else, the relationships, the friendships. We share at a law firm, not just the proceeds, but we share our families. We watch children get born and grow up and have children, and those kinds of things. And it is an extended family, and it has always mattered to us. It mattered a lot to me, and I know to you, to see that and to be part of that. So, yeah, I'm very, very proud of that.
Good. Thanks. This was fun.
Thank you.